He just wanted to renovate an abandoned house for resale. But what was hidden in the basement changed everything and shocked even the neighbors. Subscribe and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. The morning was overcast when Marcus first drove his battered truck toward the registry office. But by the time he pulled into the cracked parking lot, the clouds were parting, letting pale sunlight spill through in patchy patches. He held a thin envelope under his arm, the papers rustling softly with every movement of his hand. It felt unreal to him, as if the world had conspired to let him hold something he had no right to possess. The envelope contained the deed to a property no one in town wanted, a plot of land that had sat abandoned for years, its structures crumbling and its soil choked with weeds. The heart of the property was a decaying Victorian house, a forgotten relic that loomed darkly over the valley like an architectural ghost. He had bought the place for next to nothing, the price so low it felt more like a challenge than a transaction. Marcus stood on the steps of the registry office listening to the murmur of the street around him. A few men he recognized from the hardware store leaned against a pickup truck across the street, arms crossed as they stared at him with amused expressions. One of them spat a stream of tobacco into the dust, then shook his head. Marcus didn't need to hear their words to know what they were thinking. The whole town knew about the sale, and the whole town thought he had lost his mind. For as long as Marcus could remember, he had lived under the weight of being a nobody. His parents had been factory workers, moving from place to place depending on where the work was, and he grew up with the bitter knowledge that stability was something other people had. When other boys were playing soccer or swimming in the lake, Marcus was hunched over assembly lines carrying parts or dragging sacks of material. Grease had seeped into his skin, under his nails, and into the seams of his clothes. His hands even now bore the permanent marks of calluses, reminders that nothing in his life had come easily. The town never welcomed him. At best, they tolerated him, waving when he entered the restaurant, letting him linger on the sidelines of conversations that were never meant to include him. He was useful when a machine broke down, when someone needed arms strong enough to lift a beam or patch a roof in the dead of winter. But he was never one of them. He knew it by the way their eyes slid over him, by the way their voices softened when they spoke to him, as if addressing someone permanently outside. And yet here he was, holding papers that proved he owned something of his own. Not much. Certainly not property anyone else would have fought for, but enough. It was his. That thought, that small flame of pride, burned stubbornly within him, even as he imagined the laughter that would spread through the city until nightfall. He drove the long road to the edge of town where his new property stood. The pickup truck rocked and groaned as he steered it over potholes and ruts, passing fields long since given over to weeds. When he finally turned onto the dirt track that led to the old property, his chest tightened. There it was, the ruin he had bought with the last of his savings. The house was little more than a bent skeleton, its roof bowed and walls caving inward. A few outbuildings leaned precariously, their frames cracked like old bones. And then there was the vault. It rose from the exposed basement, a colossal block of corroded steel stained with rust. Holes punctured its sides where the metal had given way, and jagged edges caught the sunlight like teeth. Grass and weeds had grown thickly around its base, climbing its lower walls until it seemed as if the earth itself were trying to swallow it whole. Marcus turned off the engine and stood for a moment staring. There was a heaviness in the place, a sense of abandonment so deep it pressed against his chest. The silence was broken only by the ticking of the cooling engine and the distant cawing of a crow. For a moment doubt crept in. He imagined himself years from now, hunched over by failure, the land still barren, the vault still standing as a monument to his folly. But then he remembered the look in the clerk's eyes as she stamped the papers, the moment the deed had changed ownership from the county to his name. No matter what anyone said, the land belonged to him now. That truth reassured him. He stepped out onto the grass, his boots sinking slightly into the damp earth. The air smelled of rust and old rain. He walked slowly toward the vault, craning his neck to take in its full height. It seemed less like an object and more like a monument left by some long-vanished civilization. He could almost feel its age in the way the wind whispered through the open seams, producing a low hum that vibrated in his chest. He reached out, touched the cold metal, and felt flakes of rust crumble beneath his fingers. The safe no longer belonged to the city. It didn't belong to the previous owners who had dropped it. It was his now, and for reasons he couldn't explain, that thought filled him with a stubborn kind of pride. When he returned to town later that day, the smiles and low comments followed him. At the restaurant, a man laughed loudly as Marcus passed. saying something about fools and their rusty safes. Another shook his head in mock sympathy. Marcus ignored them, but their words stuck with him. He sat alone at a corner table, stirring weak coffee, pretending not to hear. Deep down, however, he knew that each insult only hardened his resolve. He had spent his entire life being the object of other people's pity or ridicule. This time, he would prove them wrong. That night, lying in the small rented room he still called home, Marcus stared at the ceiling and thought about the land. He imagined the weedy fields cleared, the house rebuilt, the barn standing straight again, and though the image of the safe loomed large, rusty, and ominous, he forced himself to see it not as a burden, but as a challenge, a test. He had bought more than land. He had bought a chance to reshape his own history. The laughter of the townspeople might echo in his ears for years, but when he closed his eyes, he felt the faint pulse of determination beating louder than his contempt. Marcus fell into a restless sleep with the papers tucked under his pillow. They were fragile, easily torn, but they carried the weight of something he had dreamed of all his life. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. Tomorrow, he would set foot on that neglected land, not as a laborer or a stranger, but as a landowner. The thought brought a faint smile to his lips as darkness closed in. The next morning, Marcus rose before the sun and stood for a long moment, staring at the crumpled papers on his kitchen table. The deed was already beginning to curl at the edges where his hands had gripped it too tightly, but the black letters on the page still told the same story. The land was his. The thought was both thrilling and terrifying. He drank his coffee quickly, the bitter liquid burning his tongue, then changed into his oldest work clothes and drove back to the edge of town, where his future awaited among weeds and ruins. When he turned off the main road and followed the rutted trail, the property looked different than it had the day before. In the pale, early morning light, the broken house and bent outbuildings looked less like a ruin and more like a battlefield after defeat. The tall grass swayed in the wind like a sea of whispers, and the safe loomed once more against the horizon, a massive shadow claiming the sky. He parked the truck near the collapsed fence and sat for a while, the engine ticking as it cooled, then got out with a shovel in one hand and a coil of rope in the other. The first few days blended into a rhythm of sweat and exhaustion. Marcus started with the obvious, the yard closest to the house. Old boards and rusty nails littered the ground, threatening to puncture his boots. He carried them in a pile, feeling each board tear at his hands, even through his gloves. The house itself leaned to one side as if ready to collapse with the next strong wind. He nailed temporary boards to the windows to keep out the worst of the weather, though he doubted the place would ever be truly safe to live in. Still, he found comfort in the act of preservation, however small. Each nail driven into the rotting structure felt like a declaration. This land wasn't finished. Not yet. Clearing the overgrowth was harder. The grass was waist-high, and thorny bushes wrapped around fence posts like barbed wire. He swung his borrowed scythe until his shoulders burned, and his back felt ready to snap. The lawnmower he'd borrowed from a neighbor coughed and swayed, but it managed to carve rough paths through the undergrowth. He worked until sweat poured down his face and his arms trembled, then forced himself to continue, blade after blade of grass falling to his determination. Each night he left behind wide swaths of bare earth where before there had been only wilderness. It was slow work, but it gave him a sense of progress, a feeling that he was peeling back the years of neglect to reveal something worth saving beneath. Everywhere he looked, traces of the past revealed themselves. Beneath a collapsed shed, he discovered an old wagon wheel, its wood rotted, but its iron rim still intact. In a pile of leaves he found a child's toy car, its faded blue plastic chipped and broken but still recognizable. Bottles lay buried in the ground, some cracked, some whole, their glass catching the light like forgotten jewels. Each object carried with it a whisper of the lives that once filled this land, people who had worked, laughed, and suffered here before fading into memory. Marcus gathered the items carefully, placing them in a box in the back of his truck. They weren't worth money, but to him they were proof that the land wasn't empty, that it still carried the stories of those who came before. And there was always the vault. No matter what task he set himself, his eyes were drawn again and again to the imposing block of corroded steel. In the midday sun it looked stern and menacing, the jagged gaps in its walls like wounds. At night, it stood silhouetted against the fading sky, its shadow stretching long across the ground until it seemed to swallow the fields whole. At night, when Marcus lay exhausted on his cot in his rented room back in the city, he found himself thinking about it. hearing in his imagination the hollow groans of metal shifting in the darkness. It wasn't just its size that disturbed him, but the way it seemed alive. When the wind blew through its broken seams, the sound wasn't simply noise, but a low, resonant hum that vibrated in his chest. Sometimes he thought it sounded like words spoken in a language too ancient to understand, carried across the fields to settle in his bones. He told himself it was nonsense, that it was just rusted steel singing to the wind, but the feeling lingered nonetheless. The townspeople continued to watch him curiously. When he drove to the hardware store to buy nails and heavy gloves, the clerk raised his eyebrows and asked if he planned to live out there among the ruins. At the restaurant, whispers followed him as he entered, conversations that fell silent until he had passed. Some laughed openly, betting on how long he would last before giving up. Others merely shook their heads in pity, convinced they were watching a man dig his own grave one shovelful of dirt at a time. Marcus ignored them as best he could, but in the stillness of the fields their words came back to him. He forced himself to keep working. Every flick of the scythe or push of the mower was a rebuttal to their scorn. Slowly, the earth began to shift under his efforts. Where grass had once grown wild and suffocating, now there were patches of bare soil ready to breathe again. The outlines of an old path revealed themselves, half-buried stones leading toward the house. He found the remains of a garden, faint rows where vegetables once grew, now waiting for someone to bring them back to life. As the weeks passed, he began to feel something new stirring within him. The land was no longer just a ruin he had purchased. It was becoming a reflection of his will. The harder he worked, the more it yielded. Each day left him more exhausted, but also more certain that he had made the right choice. For the first time in his life, he was shaping something of his own, something that would bear his mark. And yet, beneath all this progress, the safe remained. It stood untouched, a giant that refused to be ignored. He told himself he would deal with it later once the fields were cleared and the house was habitable. But in truth, he knew he was putting it off because the thought of confronting it filled him with unease. It was too big, too silent, too present. When he walked near it, the air felt cooler. The ground felt firmer beneath his boots. When he touched its metal skin, the rust flaked off his fingertips like dried blood. Sometimes he imagined it was watching him, waiting for him to make the first move. At night, his thoughts followed him into sleep. He dreamed of standing at its base, staring up into the endless darkness, the walls stretching higher than any building he had ever seen. He dreamed of hidden doors on their sides, doors that led not to the grain but to staircases descending into the earth. He woke with sweat on his skin and the echo of hollow metal ringing in his ears. Still, every morning he returned. He couldn't let fear dictate his work. The land was his and everything in it belonged to him, the vault included. He wouldn't let the laughter of the city or the shadow of a rusting monument break his resolve. For now, he worked around it, clearing the land and rebuilding what could be salvaged. But deep down, he knew the day was coming when he would have to face the vault directly. It was the heart of the farm, the center around which everything else revolved, and he wouldn't let it go unnoticed forever. One evening, after a long day of cutting thorn bushes and hauling debris, Marcus stood at the edge of the field and looked out over the land he had reclaimed. The sun was setting behind the safe, painting the sky with fire. The rusted metal gleamed in the fading light, its scars highlighted as if the day itself were reminding him of the work still undone. Marcus leaned on his shovel and let the silence settle around him. He felt bone-tired, but beneath the exhaustion lay a strange calm. The land was no longer a stranger to him. It was beginning to feel like his own. And yet as the shadows deepened and the hum of the wind through the vault grew louder, he knew the true test still awaited. The fields and the house were only the beginning. The vault, imposing and unyielding, would demand its due. By the third week, Marcus's body had adjusted to the earth's rhythm, though it didn't make the work any easier. His muscles ached constantly. His palms were raw beneath the calluses, and his sleep was a shallow cycle of drifting in dreams, only to wake to the rooster's cry hours before dawn. Still, something inside him had shifted. Where he had once looked at the property and seen only ruin, he now saw the faint outlines of possibility. The fields no longer felt like wilderness, but like land waiting to breathe again. The house, clumsily patched together with planks, still leaned, but at least the wind no longer blew freely through its broken windows. For the first time in years, Marcus began to feel like he was not just surviving, but shaping a future. But shaping a future required more than sweat and stubbornness. It required money, and that was something he barely had. The last of his savings had gone toward buying the land, and the constant expenses for tools, nails, fuel, and food were eating away at what little he had left. At night, he would count the bills in his wallet and feel the walls closing in. He wouldn't be able to continue at this pace without finding some way to bring in extra cash. His eyes always returned to the vault. The giant stood untouched, a column of rust and shadow that loomed over his every effort. In town, people called it a death trap, certain it would collapse sooner rather than later. They told stories of children who had gotten too close and emerged with rust stains on their hands, of birds that had nested inside and never returned. For Marcus, it was more than a nuisance. It was a symbol of how the world saw him. Everyone believed it would eventually crush him, just as they believed the earth itself would defeat him. One night, as he sat on the hood of his truck staring at the vault against the bloody sky, the answer came to him. The structure was useless as it was, but rusted steel still had value. If he dismantled it piece by piece, selling the metal for scrap, he could buy himself the time and supplies he needed to keep going. The thought of tearing it down filled him with both relief and unease. Relief because it would mean ridding himself of the shadow that seemed to dominate the land. Unease because there was something about the safe that seemed bigger than its rusty skin, something that resisted the thought of being destroyed. He tried to ignore this unease. The next morning, he drove into town and bought a heavier-duty crowbar, a new set of gloves, and a cutting torch. The clerk behind the counter raised an eyebrow but said nothing, though his eyes held a question Marcus could almost hear. On the way out, he overheard two men whispering to each other about that fool who was going to cut open the safe and bury himself with it. Marcus kept his head down and pressed on, but the words settled like stones in his chest. Back at the farm, he studied the vault more carefully. Up close, it was even more imposing than it appeared from a distance. The walls stretched skyward in great sheets of corroded steel, patched with shadows and holes. The seams where the panels met were thick with rust, but the structure still felt unnervingly solid, as if it had been built to withstand more than grain and weather. Marcus walked around its circumference slowly, noting the places where the metal had thinned, the spots where screws protruded loose, the edges where he could begin his work. Each step echoed with the hollow sound of his boots against the floor, and each gust of wind made the vault groan with a voice that carried through his bones. On his first day of work, he tapped the steel with his crowbar. The sound reverberated like a bell ringing, deep and resonant, sending a vibration through his arms. The noise rolled across the field and lingered, as if the safe were not merely an object but an instrument waiting to be played. Marcus recoiled, his breath catching in his throat, then forced himself forward again. He wedged the crowbar into a seam and pulled, muscles straining as flakes of rust rained down. Finally, with a scream of protest from the metal, one of the panels shifted. A section near the base gave way, revealing a narrow gap in the darkness within. The smell hit him first, a mixture of mold, old grain, and something else, something deeper and earthier, like damp soil sealed in for too long. Marcus pulled his flashlight from the truck and crouched down to shine it through the gap. The beam pierced the darkness, cutting across a floor strewn with the remains of rotting corn and broken wood. Dust swirled in the air, disturbed by the first breath of wind the vault had inhaled in years. At first glance, it was exactly what he expected, emptiness and decay. But then, as the light swept across the floor, he saw shapes that didn't belong in the ruin. Wooden crates stacked awkwardly against one wall, their edges dark with age. A tarp lay in a heap nearby, its fabric stiff but intact. And beyond that, half hidden beneath years of denial, something glowed faintly, catching the flashlight's light like a secret, refusing to stay buried. Marcus froze. For a moment he considered retreating, sealing the gap, pretending he hadn't seen anything. A sensible man might have done that, letting what was inside rot in peace. But Marcus hadn't fought so hard, hadn't spent his last savings and endured the town's laughter just to get away from the unknown. He pressed closer, his breathing shallow, his hand gripping the crowbar so tightly his knuckles turned white. The air seeping through the opening felt colder than the air outside, carrying with it a whisper of something untouched, something preserved. The discovery disturbed him more than he cared to admit. He had expected ruin, emptiness, the hollow shell of a structure long dead. What he found instead was purpose. Someone had used the vault for more than storage. Someone had deliberately left things inside, hiding them from the world. And now, by chance or fate, he had discovered their secret. As the sun dipped below the horizon and the fields darkened around him, Marcus replaced the panel he had loosened and stared at the imposing block. His pulse was still pounding, his palms slick with sweat despite the night chill. He had come to dismantle the vault for scrap, to reduce it to nothing more than piles of steel and bolts. But the moment he glimpsed the hidden shapes within, he knew nothing about this structure was simple. The metal giant was not just a burden or a monument, it was a vault, a keeper of secrets waiting to be revealed. That night back in his room he lay awake, listening to the moan of the wind against the window pane. Every time he closed his eyes he saw the faint glow inside the safe, the outline of wooden boxes buried in shadow. He wondered what might be inside, tools perhaps, or supplies left by previous owners, or perhaps something else, something that explained why the structure had been left to rust instead of being torn down years ago. The possibilities turned over and over in his mind until sleep finally claimed him. When he rose again before dawn, there were no more questions on his mind. The vault could not be ignored or dismantled without understanding what it held. Whatever secrets lay within, they were now his, and whether they brought fortune or ruin, he knew he would face them. The morning after Marcus first pried open the vault's skin, he felt a restlessness that drove him from his cot before the sky had even begun to pale. He drank his coffee in silence, staring at the rough scars on his hands where rust and steel had bitten into his skin. The memory of the previous night returned to him in fragments, the scream of metal giving way, the stench of rot and mildew, the faint glow of something not yet consumed by decay. These glimpses had disturbed him, not because they were terrifying, but because they carried a weight of intent. Someone had placed those boxes there purposefully, carefully covered and sealed them as if they were never meant to be found. He could no longer look at the vault as a steel shell. It was something more, a safe or a monument, a silence that carried history within its walls. He drove onto the land with his flashlight and crowbar rattling in the back of the truck. The fields looked gray and lifeless in the dim light, mist clinging low as if the earth itself wished to hide what lay beneath. The vault stood as always, but now it seemed different, less indifferent than before, as if aware that its secrets were no longer entirely his. Marcus approached slowly, boots crunching against gravel and broken stalks, his eyes fixed on the seam where he had pried the panel free. His hands trembled as he forced the pry bar back into place and pried the panel free once more. The gap opened like a wound, exhaling the same damp, earthy breath he had smelled before. This time he didn't hesitate. He slipped through the opening, lantern held high, and stepped into the cavernous interior. Dust particles swirled like ash in the beam of light, settling on the rotting mounds of material that had long since coalesced into solid mounds. The floor groaned beneath his boots, echoing in the hollow chamber, but he held. Against the far wall, half swallowed by shadow, stood the shapes he had seen before. Wooden boxes, some stacked, some toppled, their edges smoothed by the years but still intact. He crossed the distance slowly, each step cautious until he knelt before the nearest one. The wood crumbled beneath his fingers, but when he forced the lid, it came off with a groan. Inside were objects wrapped in oilcloth, their contours strange against the lantern light. He pulled one free, the fabric stiff with age, and carefully unwrapped it. The musty smell exploded, sharp and bitter, but beneath lay something surprising. A military helmet, its paint faded to dull green, a faint insignia still visible on its side. Marcus turned it over in his hands, running his thumb over the dent in its crown, imagining the head it might once have protected. Beneath it were more, stacked like forgotten soldiers waiting to be called up again. Another box revealed rifles, their wood swollen and cracked, but the barrels still heavy and cold. Ammunition cans sat nearby, their seals rusted, but their labels clear. In yet another he found bundles of papers tied with twine, the pages yellowed and warped. He held them up to the flashlight and could just make out government stamps, dates scrawled in fading ink, signatures of men long dead, letters, official documents, reports, all hidden here, preserved in this unlikely tomb. Marcus felt a shiver crawl down his spine. This wasn't the forgotten detritus of rural life. This was deliberate, a collection stored with care and secrecy. The safe hadn't been abandoned to the elements. It had been used as a vault, a place to hide what was never meant to be found. He leafed through a sheaf of papers and read fragments of words. Cargo confiscated, property withheld. But the ink had bled so poorly that the sentences dissolved before they reached his understanding. Still, the impression was unmistakable. Whoever had owned this farm had been involved in something far beyond plowing fields and harvesting corn. The flashlight's light wavered and he raised it higher, sweeping the beam across the camera. More boxes waited. Some collapsed in piles of chips, others intact. Tools lay scattered in heaps, wrenches, screws, spools of wire, their metal blackened but recognizable. And there, beneath a rotting tarp, something larger crouched. He pulled the fabric free and found the skeletal frame of an engine, its parts scattered across the ground like bones. Nearby were wheels, cracked and buckling leather saddles, fragments of chains. Recognition dawned on him slowly. These were motorcycles, or what had once been motorcycles, dismantled and abandoned here, as if waiting for hands that never returned. He stood among the relics, the silence pressing against him, his heart pounding with a mixture of wonder and unease. What kind of man had built this collection under the cover of a vault? Was he a collector, unable to let go of the past, a smuggler, hiding his contraband from the eyes of the law, or simply a man who feared the world so much that he buried his life's possessions in walls of steel? Marcus couldn't know it, but the thought that he now held this man's secrets filled him with both triumph and dread. The hours slipped by unnoticed as he moved from box to box, cataloging each new discovery. He found tools arranged with obsessive precision, jars of screws sorted by size, bundles of wire neatly coiled. He discovered crates of old photographs sealed in waxed paper, their images blurred by humidity but still showing faces and machines, men smiling beside their engines as if they had conquered the world. He even found a chest leaning against the far wall, its swollen lid closed. With a grunt and a pry of the crowbar, it gave way, and inside lay a leather-bound book. The cover was cracked, the pages curled and stained with mold, but the handwriting inside was still legible. Marcus's breath caught as he opened the first page and read the name scrawled there. It was a name he recognized from town gossip, the family that had once owned this farm, whispered about but never truly spoken. The words on the page were jagged, sometimes cut to a single line, other times spreading across entire pages. He read about deals made in the shadows, about dealerships that had gone bankrupt, their inventory quietly collected, of engines bought by the dozen and stored where no one could see. Pride wove through the words, but so did paranoia. Neighbors asking questions, men visiting at night, the constant need to keep everything hidden, safe, untouched. Marcus sat on the damp floor with the diary open in his lap, the flashlight casting long shadows across the chamber. The words on the page felt like whispers from another time, not merely recounting events but demanding to be heard. He realized with a sudden weight that he had not merely discovered objects, but inherited a legacy. This was no treasure to be sold for scrap. It was history tangled in secret, bound to the land he now called his own. When he finally climbed back out of the vault, the daylight seemed too bright, the air too thin. He replaced the panel carefully, as if trying to reseal the silence he had broken, but he knew it was impossible. The vault's secrets were no longer hidden. They lived in his mind now, pressed against his chest with every heartbeat. He loaded the diary into the back of his truck and sat with his hands on the steering wheel, staring at the imposing form before him. The townspeople's laughter echoed faintly in his memory, but it seemed distant now. They thought he was a fool for buying a ruin. They could never have imagined what that ruin had chosen to reveal. That night, the diary lay open on his kitchen table, its pages illuminated by a single bulb. Marcus read deeply into the hours, his eyes burning, the words seeping into him until he could no longer tell where the previous owner's obsession ended and his own curiosity began. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows, and he thought of the safe sitting in the dark, patient and silent, its secrets slowly bleeding into his life. He closed the book abruptly and leaned back in his chair, but the silence that followed was not peace. It was a waiting, a question pressing closer with each passing hour. He had come to this land to find independence, to build a future of his own. Instead, he had found a past that demanded his attention, a past that had been hidden for decades beneath steel and shadow. Whether he liked it or not, the land had given him more than property. It had given him responsibility, and he knew with a chilling certainty that his life would never be the same again. The days following Marcus's discovery were restless. He couldn't look at the vault without feeling the pull of what lay within, as if the relics hidden behind its walls were calling out to him. Each morning he returned to the farm, his tools rattling in the back of the truck, his flashlight swinging from his hand. and each night he left with more fragments of a story that seemed impossible to piece together completely. The diary never left his side. He read it at night by the dim glow of a lamp, turning the pages with hands that trembled between wonder and unease. The voice of the man who had once lived here echoed in his mind, proud, obsessive, terrified, as if time itself had chosen Marcus to become the reluctant witness to a secret life. But as his fascination deepened, so did the feeling that he wasn't alone in his interest. At first it was subtle, a pickup truck slowing down as it passed on the highway, the driver craning his neck for a longer than apparent glance. A neighbor's boy lingered near the fence longer than necessary, eyes wide as if hoping to catch a glimpse of something unusual. Marcus told himself it was nothing. The townspeople had laughed at him for weeks, and now curiosity was only natural. But then came night when, wiping the sweat from his brow after hours of carrying debris, he noticed two figures standing at the far edge of the field. They stood motionless against the dying light, faceless silhouettes, and though he raised his hand in acknowledgement, they made no gesture in return. When he took a step toward them, they had slipped into the tall grass without a sound. Sleep became harder to find. Marcus lay awake in the darkness, hearing the creaks of his rented house as if they were footsteps. He dreamed of men slipping into the vault at night, prying open the panels he had loosened and stealing away with the diary and relics before he could even wake. More than once he rose in the small hours, dressed, and drove to the estate just to make sure everything was as he had left it. Each time he found the vault standing silently, the boards he had replaced undisturbed, but the feeling of being watched never left him. Inside the vault, the discoveries grew stranger. Beyond the crates of helmets and rifles, beyond the engine parts and tools, he discovered a smaller chamber hidden behind a wall of debris. It was narrow, with a low ceiling, forcing him to duck as he entered. Here the objects were different. Boxes of papers sealed in wax, folders tied with leather straps, and beneath them, thick envelopes of money so fragile they cracked when he touched them. Among these were more personal artifacts, a sheaf of letters written in a hurried hand, photographs of men standing beside vehicles, their faces stern and unsmiling. Each piece told the same story as the diary. This farm had been more than a home. It had been a sanctuary for businesses that couldn't bear the scrutiny of daylight. Marcus carefully carried the items to the surface, loading them into the back of his truck one by one. He told himself it was just to keep them safe from moisture and rot, but part of him knew he no longer trusted the safe to keep its silence. With each artifact he moved, the place felt emptier, yet heavier, as if the very walls disapproved of his theft. The air inside grew colder, the echoes sharper, until he couldn't shake the thought that the building was watching, waiting for him to falter. His thoughts became tangled. What should he do with these discoveries? He imagined walking around town with the diary and photographs, showing them to the historical society, perhaps even the police. They would take the relics from him, study them, argue about their value, and then what? Would they leave him with nothing but rust and weeds, stripping him of the only thing that had ever felt like his? Or worse, would they accuse him of theft, of meddling in matters never meant to emerge? The thought made his chest tighten. He wasn't just a farmer anymore. He was a guardian of something he could neither explain nor surrender. One night, as he locked the truck after a long day, he noticed fresh footprints in the dirt near the fence line. They weren't his, nor the marks of any animal he knew. Footprints. He crouched down, tracing them with a trembling finger, and felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. Someone had been there, circling the property, watching. The memory of the two figures returned with sudden clarity, and he realized that the town's laughter had transformed into something more dangerous. Envy, suspicion, hunger. The air grew heavy those days, the sky darkening with a heightened attention that seemed to mirror its own. Storm clouds gathered on the horizon, low and bruised, carrying with them the promise of rain. As the first drops splattered against the windows of his truck, Marcus knew the storm would be fierce. He tried to tell himself he could weather it, that the safe had withstood decades of wind and weather, and would weather it for a while longer, but a gnawing dread wouldn't let him rest. The structure was old, rusted in places, its seams weakened by years of neglect. What if the storm was the one that finally claimed it? What if the relics were still inside? He didn't wait for morning. As the wind howled across the fields and branches whipped against the hood of his truck, Marcus drove to the farm. Lightning cracked the sky above him, illuminating the vault in striking flashes of white. It looked less like a building, and more like a shipwreck stranded on land, its sides groaning as the storm pressed against them. The rain pounded the truck's roof, drenching him as soon as he stepped out. The ground was slippery beneath his boots, mud sucking with every step. But he pressed on, driven by a single thought. If he left the relics to the storm, they would be lost forever. The vault doors shuddered as he forced them open, the wind nearly tearing them from his grasp. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of wet metal and decay. Water poured through cracks in the ceiling, dripping down the walls in glistening rivulets, pooling on the floor until it glinted under the swing of his lantern. The moan of the storm outside mingled with the lament of the structure itself. Beams shifted, screws strained, every place alive with complaint. Marcus wasted no time. He ripped off the boards covering the hidden camera and began dragging what he could. The diary went first, then the bundles of letters, the photographs sealed in their flimsy envelopes. He dragged a tool chest toward the stairs, muscles screaming as the weight threatened to pull him down. Above him, thunder boomed so loud it shook the floor, dust raining down from the rafters. He imagined the roof caving in, burying him alive under decades of rust. Still, he pressed on, carrying armful after armful to the truck, staggering through sheets of rain until the bed was half full of salvaged history. Each trip back inside felt more perilous than the last. A beam snapped with a sound like a gunshot, plummeting to the ground just meters from where he stood. The floor gave way ominously under his weight, water seeping through the cracks. He knew he was running out of time. Finally, his strength nearly gone, he grabbed a final cloth-wrapped bundle and staggered toward the door. As he emerged into the storm, lightning tore through the sky, bathing the vault in a white flame. For a heartbeat, it seemed whole again, magnificent, its rusted sides gleaming as if alive. Then thunder rolled, and the vision shattered. With a groan that sounded almost like a sigh, the vault gave way. The ceiling bowed inward, then collapsed, sending a cascade of steel and wood plummeting into the hollow interior. Sparks flashed briefly, where metal scraped against hidden wires, and then it was over. The giant lay broken, a ruin swallowed by the rain. Marcus stood in the deluge, his chest heaving, his arms cradling the final bundle, the bed of his truck overflowing with what little he had managed to salvage. The diary, the photographs, the letters, the tools, engine fragments. Behind him, the storm claimed the rest, drowning decades of secrets in mud and debris. He felt no triumph, only exhaustion and a strange certainty that something greater than himself had been decided that night. As dawn broke, the storm broke, leaving the sky washed pale and clean. Steam rose from the wreckage as the sun touched it, the twisted steel glinting faintly as if mocking him. Marcus sat in the back of his truck, soaked to the skin, and stared at what remained. The land was changed forever. The vault, once a monument to secrecy, was gone, but the weight of its legacy pressed down heavier than ever. He had saved fragments, but more importantly, he had been chosen as its guardian. The city's laughter no longer mattered. The storm had tested him, and though it had nearly buried him, he had endured. And as he stared at the ruin, the journal clutched at his side. Marcus understood that the land had given him not only ownership, but responsibility. He was no longer the man who had bought a ruin for pennies. He was the man who carried his story forward, whether he wanted to or not. The morning after the storm, Marcus stood before the vault's wreckage, mud sucking at his boots as he moved slowly around the twisted mass of steel and splintered wood. The once imposing structure was now nothing more than a heap of rusted bones, its silence replaced by the occasional groan of metal settling deeper into the earth. The storm had been merciless, stripping the land of its illusions and reducing what had stood for decades to ruin in the space of a single night. He should have felt defeated, but instead he felt strangely calm. He had been tested, and though the storm had taken much from him, it had left him enough. In the back of his truck, covered with a tarp, lay the fragments he had recovered. The diary, the boxes of papers, the photographs, the scattered tools, and the pieces the water hadn't yet claimed. They were mere pieces compared to the whole that had been lost, but they were more than nothing. They were proof that the secrets buried in the vault hadn't entirely disappeared. In the days that followed, the townspeople came to see the aftermath. Trucks slowed as they passed on the road, drivers leaning out their windows to shake their heads or laugh at the sight of the ruin. Some stopped to speak to Marcus, their words dripping with false sympathy, their eyes straying to the tarp on the back of his truck. He gave them little to cling to. He told them only that the storm had taken what was destined to fall sooner or later. Nothing more. Let them gossip. Let them speculate. The truth was his alone to bear, and he felt no need to share it with those who had mocked him from the beginning. He rented a small warehouse on the outskirts of town, a space no larger than a single room, but dry and safe enough for what he needed. There, with silent reverence, he arranged the salvaged relics. The diary lay open on a table, its pages carefully dried and pressed flat. Photographs were spread out in orderly rows, their images blurred but still holding glimpses of faces and places long gone. Tools and engine parts rested along the walls, stacked as if waiting for hands that might one day restore them. In that shed, Marcus found something he hadn't expected, a sense of purpose. What had begun as desperation to own a piece of land, to prove himself against the ridicule of others, had blossomed into something greater. He was no longer just a farmer struggling to build a life from ruin. He was the keeper of a story, the guardian of a legacy that had chosen him through chance and persistence. At night, when the wind rose and rattled the walls of his rented house, he would sit at the table with his journal open, reading the words of the man who had come before him. The handwriting told the story of a life consumed by gathering and secrecy, of deals made in the shadows, of a fear of losing what had been gathered. Marcus felt the weight of this obsession pressing down on him, threatening to seep into his very bones. But unlike the man before him, he felt no impulse to hoard in silence. He felt instead a responsibility to preserve, to honor, to ensure that what had been hidden in the darkness would not be lost again. When he returned to the farm, the absence of the safe left a strange void in the sky. The land seemed smaller without it, less burdened, but also lonelier. He walked among the weeds that had already begun to reclaim the broken beams and panels, and in his mind, he imagined something new rising there. Not another vault, not a monument to secrecy, but a place of memory. A building that could one day hold the relics in the open light, a place where others could come to see the history that had been left to rot. Thoughts churned within him with surprising force, shaping a vision he had never dared consider before. The city continued to whisper, but its laughter no longer pierced him. He had survived their mockery, survived the storm, and survived the collapse of the very thing they said would crush him. In its fall, the vault had remade him. He was no longer the man who had bought a ruin for pennies, no longer the outsider defined by the pity of others. He was the man who had discovered a history hidden in steel, who had carried fragments of the past through wind and rain, and who now bore the burden of ensuring that it endured. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in fiery hues, Marcus stood in the field where the vault had once cast its shadow. The wreckage was already sinking into the earth, weeds rising defiantly through the twisted metal. He felt the cold weight of the diary in his hands, the leather cracked but strong, its pages whispering with the voice of the man who had come before. For the first time in years, Marcus felt peace. The storm had stripped away everything fragile, leaving only what mattered, the strength to endure, the will to preserve, and the knowledge that he had become part of a story larger than himself. He looked up at the horizon, the land stretching out before him, and saw not ruin, but promise. The laughter of the townspeople faded into nothingness, carried away by the night wind. This place, broken and battered as it was, belonged to him, and in the quiet glow of the fading light, Marcus understood that he hadn't merely inherited land or relics. He had inherited a destiny. If this story kept you hooked, be sure to hit that subscribe button so you never miss the next incredible twist. Want more shocking discoveries? Watch the next video right here and dive even deeper into secrets people never expected to find. And don't keep it to yourself. Share this video with your friends so they can try it too.